I'm Ian. I'm a landscape architect and archaeologist. I'm a director at LDA Design, and I'll be talking us through a very brief and rapid overview of the process of landscape character assessment and its application. Um, and a quick shout out to the Cotswolds National Landscape team, who very kindly provided a lot of the images, which are in chronological order, I believe. So just a little bit of fun in the use of the images. Um, like I say, landscape character assessment is a huge topic. And what I wanted to do is just talk about, from a landscape architect perspective, how we assemble a landscape character assessment, how we apply it, but also significantly the role of heritage professionals and heritage knowledge in the creation of a landscape character assessment. It's really important. So we'll quickly touch on what we mean by landscape, or what I mean by landscape. We'll explore the tools for assessing landscape character, and then we will see how it can be applied to design and decision making and policy making. What is landscape? This is one of the definitions I use, and we touched on this, I think, in the very first introduction to the special interest group. Uh, Land is meaning home or territory or place where people belong, and scape means to create. So that, for me, has a really important message around landscape being about people, about interaction between people and the land to create landscape. That's echoed in the European Landscape Convention about landscape being an area as perceived by people whose character is a result of the action and interaction of natural and/or human factors. And if we use that definition for both rural areas, it also applies to urban, townscape, and marine seascape as well. The important message, I think, now is there's perceptions by people, and it's the interaction of natural and cultural factors. In very broad terms, landscape reflects the relationship between people and place, and it plays an important part in our everyday lives. It's a product, as we said, about the interaction of natural and cultural components, and importantly, how they're understood and experienced. Landscape character assessment follows a well-established process developed over many years. The first really significant guidance was published in 2002, and it's taken several iterations to the current guidance for landscape character assessment, which was published in 2014. Assessment, I think, is really important. It's robust, it's auditable and transparent. It really helps us understand and describe the landscape around us to inform judgments around decision making and design and the management of change. Landscapes are part of our cultural heritage. They're a record of human endeavor over millennia. If we take the time to read and understand those landscapes with sympathetic planning, design, and management, we can better reveal that heritage and provide a more harmonious link between us and the natural world for the benefit of both. I think I want just to flag the importance of interprofessional working, heritage consultants working with landscape professionals, ecologists, and members of communities to really give a rounded understanding of place, landscape to inform design. How to read a landscape. These are the three really important guidance documents. On the left is an approach to landscape character assessment published by Natural England in 2014. Then there's the Landscape Institute Townscape Assessment Guidance and an approach to seascape character assessment, again published by Natural England. All follow the same principles, which we'll run through, but there are just slight nuances for townscape and seascape related to those particular environments, but the principles apply. And it's worth mentioning that Natural England's currently reviewing the approach to landscape character assessment at the moment. Really important. You'll see these little green arrows pop up. They just point to heritage and cultural heritage considerations, which are particularly relevant to us as cultural heritage experts. The landscape wheel really, I think, encapsulates that idea about landscape being a combination of natural and cultural forces. and also the perceptual and aesthetic qualities that we as people experience that turns land into landscape. So looking at the cultural and social, it's about land use, settlement, enclosure, land ownership, time depth. HLC will capture some of this, but this is a slightly different and more rounded view of what landscape character assessment encapsulates. This horrible and complex flow diagram is the process that we adopt if we're going to undertake a robust landscape character assessment, but we'll break that down. Step one is to define the purpose and scope of the assessment. And when we're defining that scope, we need to make sure we've got the skills and specialisms involved that are necessary to produce a robust, rigorous, and well-informed assessment. And I think access to heritage consultants and heritage experts is key to those skills and specialisms to ensure that heritage consideration is included. Step two is a desk study element where you gather a lot of information, both written and in map and GIS form. Included within those are historic landscape and seascape characterizations, a review of policy and designations, some of which will be heritage designations, and also consideration and ideally the mapping of non-designated heritage assets and areas and landscapes is really, really useful. When we review the baseline of cultural and social factors, again, we're looking at that land use, settlement, enclosure, time depth, and land ownership. And also, really importantly and often overlooked, cultural associations, associations of in art or literature, in myths and legends, music, people with particular landscapes. And I think for some landscapes, that's very obvious, Constable in Suffolk, but in other places, it's less obvious or tangible, but no less important for really appreciating how people perceive, understand, and enjoy landscapes. So landscape character assessment as a process tries to combine all of those, and there's a role for stakeholders in that particular element of the work. And in step three, again, can't underestimate the value of the field study. You've got to be out there to really understand those perceptual and aesthetic qualities, but also see how heritage and cultural landscapes are evident, experienced, how the different assets interact with each other, how time depth is revealed, how complex palimpsest landscapes can be understood. So again, even in the field, we're thinking about cultural heritage, cultural associations, and how they're experienced. Then we combine the field survey with the desk-based study, refine the mapping and refine the descriptions to classify and describe landscape character types and or areas, identify key characteristics, and then map these different areas. And we make the distinction between landscape types and landscape character areas. And there's a diagram here that differentiates between the two as part of what's called the landscape assessment hierarchy, which goes from broad areas to individual types to more detailed areas to more detailed types. So it all slots together in a seamless and hopefully very understandable hierarchy of types and areas. So the example here is the South Pennines National Character Area. And that character area has got a geographic name, so it's geographically specific, breaks down into several landscape character types, such as high moorland plateaus and moorland hills. Those moorland hills, as a landscape type, can get broken down into local landscape character areas, and those again can be broken down into local, very detailed landscape character types. And that hierarchy is established across the country, although it's not quite seamless across different local authority boundaries. Several years ago, we did a character assessment of the Cotswolds, what was then the AONB, but is now the Cotswolds National Landscape. Really enjoyable piece of work, and I think really taught me how important heritage and historic landscape is to reading the contemporary landscape and defining and describing landscape character. So we obviously look at geology and landform, and those are two really important precursors to historic land use and contemporary land use. Um, but we also look at agricultural land classification, habitats, designations for biodiversity, how people access the land and footpaths, etc., and draw together our own map of landscape character. And what you'll see if we flick between that character map and maybe the landform, you'll see that's a really important determinant of landscape character types and areas. Uh, the red line is the AONB National Landscape Boundary, but obviously those landscapes blur beyond those edges, and it's just important to recognise that and see landscape as a continuum. For each landscape character type, in this instance, there's an overall description of its key characteristics, the landscape character, and then we describe its physical influences and human influences. And that's where we can draw in a lot of the cultural heritage information, refer to designations, refer how historic sites appear in the landscape, um, talk about the evolution of those landscapes from the Neolithic, Bronze Age, right the way through to industrial period change and parliamentary enclosure, etc., etc. So we start to begin to be able to tell a really interesting story about each individual landscape type. In this case, it's the escarpment outliers. And then for each outlier, if you look at that little map, each one of those becomes its own landscape character area. And again, there's a short description about the character and qualities of those individual character areas. They share the same overall characteristics of the type, i.e. they're all escarpment outliers, but each one's individual and can be described on its own merits. Townscape, no different. So you'll recall the landscape wheel. This is the townscape wheel in the Landscape Institute guidance. And again, we see the cultural, social being described as part of land use, cultural expression, land ownership, and time depth again. Application, you'll see landscape character assessments in neighbourhood plans. There's a nice example in Milton under Wychwood, near us in Oxford, which uses the Oxford Character Assessment Toolkit. Very useful for neighbourhood plans where local communities are involved in identifying what is valued and important, but it's all based on a objective description of landscape and townscape character. Really important component, in fact, an essential component of landscape and visual impact assessment. It describes the landscape in terms of baseline, and it's a really important part of the methodological process for describing effects and also informing design. Sensitivity and capacity studies, design placemaking, design guidance, all refer to landscape character assessment. We'll provide the slides, and here are some hopefully useful resources. And if we've got 2 minutes, there's a lovely case study for the Waterbeach Newtown, where landscape character and an understanding of heritage was integral to the placemaking. Waterbeach, a new town of 10,000 new homes north of Cambridge, was in the Cambridgeshire Fens. So we had a look at the heritage of the Fen adventurers and pioneers who drained the land to create the current agricultural landscape, so a sense of pioneer spirit. We looked at the historic landscape patterns around the drainage to inform landscape structure and the idea of small Benstead communities within a strong landscape framework. And we also looked at non-designated heritage assets like this lovely, very insignificant, seemingly winding former drove road called Banor Drove, which turned into one of the most important anchoring features of the whole development. We kept the wiggle, we kept the alignment of this drove, not designated, not recognised as historically important, but without landscape character assessment, the value of that to the design would have been missed. And with that, I will stop presenting, and I don't know how to do that, but I'll find a way and pass over to Kat now. if that's okay, and then we'll take questions later.
Thanks, Ian. That was great. Although obviously as a peatland archaeologist, I despise all building on fens and we should absolutely not be doing that. I'm now going to try and present as soon as you've unpresented.
Stop sharing. Yeah, there we go.
Let's see if this is going to work. Nope, nope, don't do that. And, there we go. So hopefully you guys can see that. Just give me a thumbs up if you can. I am Kat Hopwood-Lewis. I currently work for Natural England and I am the Senior Peatland Historic Environment Officer. I'm also a member of the UK and Ireland Working Party on Cultural Heritage of Peatlands. And in my day job, I am embedded in the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme. So what I do is I read an awful lot of what we call historic environment assessments, but that might be termed in other parts of heritage, might be called a heritage impact assessment. And they tend to comprise of desk-based assessments, some limited field work, and advice. And today I'm going to focus on the kind of impact assessment and advice part of those, because much as I'd love to talk about surveying and archaeological potential and exciting peatland archaeology, that's the bit where we're kind of underperforming a little bit as contractors, as curators, as archaeologists in general. But a lot of what I say here is relevant to nature-based solutions generally and a lot of work outside of the planning remit. At the end of this presentation, I've got some examples of good practice. I'm mindful of the competition statement. If I name a company, that doesn't mean they're the only company who do that thing. There's lots of good practice out there, and I'm just sharing some examples of work that I'm familiar with. And I believe if anyone needs policy background, that the 2023 CIfA conference recordings may still be available. So if you're really interested in peatland archaeology, you can hear me waffling on about that and restoration back then. So when I give this slide to my colleagues in the natural environment, it's the other way around, because they're like, oh yes, it's obviously naturally important. Is there archaeology as well? Here, we know that peatlands are exciting for archaeology. The same waterlogging and exclusion of oxygen that locks in greenhouse gases into peat and gets ecologists very excited is the same mechanism that is excluding decay mechanisms and preserving us those lovely organic remains that are giving us iconic sites like Star Carr, Flag Fen, Gunnister Man, preserving for sort of finds like the Caron Cog or bog body, and you know, but those sites are also providing ecosystem services, and they are quite often the drivers behind peatland restoration. Those include biodiversity for habitat, flood prevention, because wet peat acts as a sponge and slows down the flow of water, so reduces downstream flooding, and it can act as a filter and improve water quality. But the main driver at the moment is greenhouse gases, and that is because most of our bogs are degrading. Over 80% of the peatland resource in the UK, and that's across all of the devolved nations, are considered to be in poor condition. So instead of trapping carbon from the atmosphere as they should do and providing all of these lovely services, protecting our heritage, in fact, what they are doing is emitting greenhouse gases. And it's approximately 15% of our annual emissions comes from peat bogs. So there's a real driver and a priority to restore these bogs as part of our contribution to net zero. And the scale of this is massive. If I give you an example from Scotland, they are attempting to do 150,000 hectares. So a hectare is a kilometre square for people who aren't familiar with that measurement, by 2030. The England target was only a 5-year target. It was 35,000 hectares for 5 years, ending this March, and we've nearly hit it. And then we will be getting new targets. Last I heard, this was going to be something like another 180,000 hectares. And we have similar targets in Northern Ireland, slightly smaller in Wales. So it's a huge amount of work that's going on in the countryside in areas that we know are of high archaeological potential and have archaeology within them. So are we concerned about this? We're slightly concerned about it, but we're also slightly optimistic about it. And here's a kind of statement from Historic England that really talks about the trade-offs that we accept when it comes to peatland archaeology, because obviously if our archaeological features are embedded within those soil matrices, which are becoming dry, becoming friable, losing their waterlogging, then those historic features themselves are at risk. And that occurs whether they're on top of the peat, within the peat itself, or sealed by it in underlying landforms. And so you see this very unusual statement from Historic England, which came out in 2021, about doing nothing, and basically remedial actions are necessary and enable an initial limited, managed and unrecorded loss, in preference the alternative, which would be a continued uncontrolled and unrecorded loss. And that's something that we're actually quite familiar with, because that's a situation that we're in development control. But most of these peatland projects fall outside EIA, fall outside NPPF, and quite often the only reason we're considering historic environment within them is either because of grant scheme rules, which is the case in England with Nature for Climate, but also in Northern Ireland with the Peatland Challenge Fund, where archaeology is considered by the environmental statements. In Scotland and Wales, there's more of a focus on designations as opposed to undesignated sites, but we still get that slight coverage from the peatland code. So if one of the motivators for restoring peatlands is the sale of carbon credits for offsetting, then the peatland code now states, or peatland code 2.0 now states, that the historic environment should have been taken into consideration during that process, but it doesn't describe how. And so historic environment assessments and providing that written audit form is one way that they can prove that their carbon credits are sustainable and have considered the historic environment. So what do damaged peatland look like? This is an image from IUCN Peatlands UK, who are kind of umbrella organisation for a lot of the natural environment causes and information about peatlands. And they have a cultural heritage section, which we've been kind of poking them to do more with, and they have just redeveloping their website. This is one of their graphics, and it's lovely to see loss of historic archive in there as one of the problems caused by damaged peatland. And what they're really referring to there is the paleoecological archive that is retained within the peat, because it's laid down stratigraphically, because it retains that environmental evidence. We have things like pollen, we have environmental macrofossils, varroidal carboniferous particles, all sorts of lovely, yummy data concerned within the peat. But if we look at this degraded example, you can see that's not waterlogged, that's not retaining any lovely organic remains. We can see active erosion at the front of the picture near the DOC label for dissolved organic carbon. You can see mineral soils. So if we've got any Mesolithic flint, for example, underlying, that's going to be popping out of there. Any earthworks in there are going to be trashed. Any features are going to be, that are structural, are going to be liable to collapse. So damaged peatland is not good for anyone. And what kind of features are we talking about? I've got a horrible little sort of side pop-up that's masking my notes, and I need those, so bear with me 1 second. But I've been collating data from my specific grant scheme. So these are England specific, and on the last 122 Nature for Climate sites, which were mainly upland, but some lowland, we had 114 designated assets, and this is kind of the breakdown here. So you'll see very few battlefields or registered parks and gardens. We have no reference to RECs because this is a terrestrial grant scheme. But what we did have is really kind of like high amounts of air crash sites. We had loads of scheduled monuments. We had some listed buildings, but they tended to be kind of structures rather than buildings as you might consider them. We had big coverage from World Heritage Sites, mainly the frontiers of the Roman Empire and the tin mining landscape, because those are co-located with peatland environments. And 92% of our grant scheme sites also contain known heritage assets. And pretty much all of them contain archaeological potential. So what are the impacts that we tend to see from this kind of work? Obviously, we see ground disturbance. If you look at the top left photo, that's a scallop bund, which is intended to retain water on the moors. You also see a lot of use of borrow pits to win material to fill moorland grips or drains. Lots of machine on there. In the lowlands more, we tend to get things construction. So the central image is of someone putting in sluice gates in a lowland peatland site to control the water flows there. The whole point of peatland restoration is to re-wet, so we will almost always have water level change, but we can have chemical change as well. There are techniques such as adding biochar to the environment, which is type of charcoal, and that's intended to increase the carbon capture potential of the site. That can be quite intrusive. Limeseed fertilizer is another technique that's widely used in the uplands, where the acidity of those upland bogs is such that we can't actually get bare peat to revegetate. And if we're loving our paleoecological archives that are preserving pollen and lots of nice things because they're acidic, and then we promptly put lime on them, then that's undermining the geochemical stability of the burial environment. So in terms of visual impacts, a lot of peatland restorations, like those scallop bunds, will start to fill in and silt up over time. That's part of the process. So some of those are temporary, but if you look on the bottom left, you can see stone dams, and they can be quite visually intrusive, particularly in an area that is like a cairnfield or something like that. Vegetation management, you can often see quite large machinery going onto sites, flailing, tree removal from peatland. So that can have impact, and lots of ancillary activities, the access of the machines, the construction of things like heli lift sites, they can also have impact. But that said, we can manage this in the same way that we manage development control. We can manage the impacts of peatland restoration. And I think one thing to bear in mind with this kind of nature-based solution is they're often very extensive and they take place over very large areas of land. So when you are dealing with construction, a ground plan is quite often really tight. There's a lot of services, things have to go where they have to go for architectural reasons. In nature-based solutions, there's quite often a dialogue between the various specialists and the people coming up with these restoration plans about where interventions go. And there's much more flexibility to do redesign instead of jumping straight to mitigation. Of all of these, I've just done a little pulse on water level change because this is the one people tend to hyper focus on setting and on ground disturbance and completely ignore water level change. And that is the one really that is definitely going to happen and has fairly unknown impacts on the burial environment. So I said I was going to talk about some good examples of things that happen. This is kind of the standard. This is the traffic lights approach. The reason why this is so widespread in peatland restoration is it's developed by one of the early peatland partnerships up in Yorkshire. And one of the managers from that partnership is Tim Tom, who is a co-author of Conserving Bogs, the Management Handbook, second edition, which is a bit of a Bible for peatland restoration. And so he put the methodology that he was used to into that book. And if you're interested, it's section 3.1.7, archaeological, paleoecological and historical interest. But it's pretty much kind of a paragraph. It says you should do some archaeology, but it doesn't go into how to do it in any kind of great detail. So in this approach, we have red zones where we don't go amber zones where you can go under certain circumstances, and green zones where, yes, there's historic interest, but you can effectively do what you like. And this approach quite often underestimates the potential for surprises in peatlands. And so Natural England have developed, filmed and have made available freely a toolbox talk for peatland contractors. That's the people on the ground, the machine operators, to try and alert them to what they might find in this kind of circumstance. Downsides of this approach, they have a terrible tendency to combine archaeology with other access constraints, so you don't always know what those exclusion zones and polygons are really focused on and whether they're proportionate or not. And it quite often doesn't show the type of works and the archaeological features on the same map. So moving on to a more modern approach, Moore & Vale is a company run by sole trader Jim Brightman, who has given me permission to show some of his maps here. And he does a lot of work across the north of England. He's based an approach on traffic lights, but created a lot more nuance within it. So he really talks about what kind of activities can and can't be done, rather than a simple stop, go, caution approach. When he does surveys, he includes visibility indexes so that you can tell if the vegetation has been high when he's had to go out. This is all good standard practice, but it's really easy for funders to approve. Sometimes I will get a use of a standard CIfA template that's been designed for construction, and it will have 8 pages of totally extraneous information about MPPF in it that doesn't even apply to the project. It's flat out wrong, and that's before you even start reading the report. A Moore & Vale peatland restoration HEA can quite often be 8 pages long in toto, including gazetteer. Right, and contractors love that because what they want is short, punchy documents that tell them what they need to know. Now, you won't be able to read this right in. I put it in very optimistically and it's way too small. But if you can't read it, what you'll be able to see is it's got red constraints areas, amber constraints areas, green constraints areas, and he's talking about the type of activities you can do in those, rather than just being a clear stop go. And the other thing that he often does is use the aerials to underpin rather than the OS maps, which is much more useful in these kind of remote rural areas. And it's the kind of thing that the peatland contractors themselves use. This example is from Grass Hill Common in Teesdale, and you'll see that in these red areas, this is a lead mining area. And so exclusion zones work really well on small isolated cairns, small scheduled monuments, but when you get to these big extensive mining landscapes, it's very difficult to exclude because you're excluding the very eroding area that you want to address. So in this example, in his guidance, he's distinguished between the kind of invasive works like peat dams that might cause collapse of the features and spread of the associated contaminated spoil, and then works that he says, and if I quote here, benefit the stability of the landform, and that's things like spreading brash, reseeding and damming, which are actually reinforcing the archaeology and making that bit better. So moving on to another example, Southwest Water, a utility company, as you might expect. They are the main partner in the Southwest Peatland Partnership, and they have a very innovative approach in that they have their own in-house archaeologists. And if Martin isn't here, he's probably watching the recording later because he knows I'm going to name check him. Shout out to Joe and Phil down at the Southwest as well. They go a step further. They don't have their own standalone reports. They've abandoned that. And this is a contents page from the peatland restoration plan. And the little highlighted historic environment bit, you can see they are a chapter within the main plan. They are fully integrated into that plan. There's going to be no leaving this in the cabin and then taking the rest of the plan out on site. It's all in there. There's great mitigation advice, and it actually gives contractors reasons for why they're doing something or why not doing something. That when they talk about their impact assessment, they really break down the various different impacts that can be expected from an activity, talk about mitigation proposals, and then they do a second impact assessment for what is the residual impact after that mitigation has been applied. So it's really, really clear. They're not saying that there's no impact at all, but they are really spelling it out. And they show works and archaeological features on the same map. Again, they're really integrated. So here's an example of their reasons for exclusion. They have found that their contractors are a lot more engaged if they actually have a reason for why they do it. And at this point, they've got such good relationships with some of their digger staff that they are reporting archaeological features to them and calling them out. And I think there's one example made the press last year. They actually found a Mesolithic forest layer. And that was because the digger drivers were noting that stuff and calling people here to deal with it. And we've got some great samples from that and some great paleoecological data. Fern Archaeology, they're another company that do a lot of habitat restoration stuff. And they've got quite standard CIfA looking templates, but they again have really gone into spelling out the impact assessment and talking about archaeological potential. They always do a site visit if there's setting issues so they can actually see it on the ground. They recognize that lots of computer modeling and what have you can't really replace just going out and having a look and seeing what's there. But they have taken on board everything that the grant scheme guidance says and put everything in that order to make it really easy for a funder to see it and go, yes, does this check against my guidance? Does it meet our minimum standards? Yes, brilliant, funding assigned, everybody gets paid. And I think what I see time and time again is we've created one template. We think it fits CIfA standards and guidance. It looks the same for every job that we do. And I would really urge people who are engaged in this kind of work to go on the Archaeological Data Service, look at other peatland restoration things and take the best bits of each of them, develop your own templates that respond to this kind of work, because those peatland contractors are looking for archaeologists that they feel understand them. So ask them questions, get to understand their techniques, get to understand the things that come from them, and you will build that kind of relationship, get repeat business, get the best outcomes for the historic environment, but also get the best outcomes for you, make your money, do well, everything will be kosher. So that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions about any of that?
We do have a question in the chat, which I think is for Ian, which is a question on whether the LVIA guidance for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, are they similar to what you were speaking about?
My understanding is guidelines for landscape visual impact assessment applies to all. Landscape character assessment differs slightly in Wales and Scotland. Land map is in Wales, and I think there may be slight nuances around certain aspects of landscape character assessment, but generally the principles apply around landscape being a combination of cultural, natural, and aesthetic and perceptual qualities. But land map granulates that into a lot more aspects, I think they're called.
So I've got a question for you, Ian, if that's all right. As
It
well as
wasn't peat.
no, it's not Pete.
It was
When
farmland.
when it's thinking about this from the perspective of land management, as well as being a professional archaeologist myself, Natural England obviously have our nature reserves, and so we are landowners as well. If you're thinking about making changes to land use and changes to the environment, when would you encourage people to undertake a landscape character assessment?
Brilliant question. I would encourage anyone to undertake a landscape character assessment at the earliest possible opportunity, refer to published landscape character assessments at the national and local scale for context. And then if you've got specific issues at a site or area scale, it can help to do a more localized landscape character assessment within that assessment hierarchy. Identify both landscape character areas or types, their key characteristics, and then also what's valued about those landscapes, what you want to retain, what you want to enhance, what your vision for the future of the landscape will be in relation to enhancing ecosystem services, better revealing heritage assets, better connected nature conservation, improving public access, all can get wrapped up into how the landscape character assessment is applied. But the earlier you do it, the better able it is to inform decision making and investment.
Brilliant, thanks. So we've got a question from Jennifer Morrison, I believe.
Thanks, Kat. I'm Jenny Morrison, one of the EA archaeologists. It's a question for you, Kat. We had a traffic light style assessment done for a peatland restoration scheme. And it's fine having the exclusion zones around known monuments, but in this case there was a potential for geoarchaeology, which the assessment didn't cover. So after we'd done the assessment, we had to go and do some field work. How best do you think a desk-based assessment can address the potential for geoarchaeology? Because in this particular case, obviously the peatland restoration people thought that because they were avoiding the known archaeology that there wasn't an issue, when in actual fact there was.
I had absolutely tons of slides about archaeological potential and interpreting it, and I had to cut them all for our time scale. But effectively, you're 100% right that the known archaeological resource in peatland is just a tip of a tiny iceberg, and everything else lies beneath. People are quite bad at working out archaeological potential. They either tell you that there's nothing mapped, so there's nothing there, which is really bad practice, or they tell you that all peat has high archaeological potential because it's peat, which is equally bad practice. I think what you have to do is use the finds and the sites that surround the area as a proxy to let you know what kind of level of activity is there in the past. So the kind of things that sort of trigger my spidey sense that I need more mitigation are things like multi-period finds and sites around it, sites that are settlement based or finds that are associated with settlement rather than with casual loss, intensive land use in the area, and certain types of deposits. As soon as I see that there's been a known find of some kind of ritual nature, that means to me that they're using that area for that, and you can find all sorts of surprising things in that instance. So the Toolbox talk is an attempt to kind of rope people in to acting as eyes and ears for archaeologists and getting those people who are always there on the ground involved. But watching briefs tend to be de-emphasized in peatland environments because of the nature of the work. It's much, much bigger than construction. There's often many machines going on at the same time, and you can't work between them. And also because of the poor visibility. So working in autumn and winter in low light levels and with poor contrast between your finds and your soil types, it makes it very difficult to find things. So I would only put watching briefs on where I'm looking for kind of bulky stuff like structures or a stone circle that's antiquarian and has been found in the past, but we've lost it, that kind of thing. It's more a case of having call-off contracts. So if that your contractors do find something, you have someone lined up and ready to go who can come in and assess that and deal with it. And geoarchaeology, I will say I'm not a geoarchaeologist, but you can do, if you suspect presence, you can take some samples up front and sort of mitigate in that way. And
Yeah,
Mickey
we
is a
ended
geoarchaeologist and is nodding at me. She's been waiting for me to get around to that point.
we ended up doing some field work rather than going down the route of a watching brief. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with these, the reason why I said, you know, we start with a desk-based assessment and then you take a measured view about whether you understand the archaeological resource. And if all you've got are casually reported finds, but you've never had a systematic archaeological survey, then you need to do that. You know, there are some landscapes that have been studied so intensively, have had loads of aerial mapping, that there are bits of the Yorkshire Dales where I've spoken with the HER and they're like, nope, we understand everything that's there on the surface. It's only the stuff underneath that we don't understand. Equally, there can be whole areas that are just completely blank in terms of archaeological survey and where you really do need to do that work. I'm just going to go into the chat because there was another one for me from Richard Hughes, who says, is there a process to follow up on measuring the success of mitigation actions to determine the acceptability of resulting residual risk? And there is. So when this process was being done under agri-environment funding, we didn't have any money for monitoring, and that was a real problem. We were kind of doing things and hoping that we'd done the correct thing. Nature for Climate includes 5 years of monitoring. So we have baseline ground conditions and water level monitoring for all of the sites. And we've included sensors in all of them. So at the end of this grant scheme, which has just had an extension into 25-26, so I can't do it quite yet, I'm hoping to look at all of those water levels that are near archaeological sites and see if what has been predicted to happen has in fact actually happened. And there will also be aerial monitoring. So we'll be using the satellite sensors and Google Earth to look at how the vegetation is responding and how the bare peat is being consolidated. And one last one from Janine. Are there any toolbox talks available for use? Yes, they are. They are free to use for everyone on Natural England's YouTube channel. So just Google peatland restoration, you'll find it there.
We also have one other question in the chat that's kind of to the both of you on how do we get these excellent messages across to non-heritage organizations who maybe don't realize the benefits of an integrated approach? What has been both of your experience in that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Keep talking about landscape matters to whoever will listen, and especially
those
to
who
people
don't
who
want to
don't listen. Yeah. I think today has been a really good example of how different areas of built environment and environmental professionals come together: ecology, cultural heritage, hydrologists, archaeologists, historic landscape experts, etc. So if we talk to each other, cross-sell our expertise and skills to get the best outcomes, I think to clients, to communities, to local authorities, the better places we'll find ourselves. It's a really important issue at the moment with the way the government is pushing forward on various agendas about growth. We need really good collaborative working across all these agendas to get the best outcomes. And I strongly believe ecosystem services is going to be an increasingly important part of the conversation, to which heritage professionals, landscape professionals, ecologists all have a really, really, really important contribution.
I think from my perspective, it's kind of a two-pronged approach going from the top down and the bottom up. So at the moment, we've got some really important consultations that are live. The land use framework is one of them. I always respond to those. I'm a total geek. And even where there's not an organisational response from Natural England that I'm involved in, I'll quite often ping one in as a private citizen because I'm kind of like that. It takes you 10 minutes and you can get your views heard on some really interesting stuff there. And what's interesting when, you know, the consultations are closed and summarised is sometimes you can see your wording in there and know that they listened to you and that what you said was educated and of interest to them. So that's kind of top down lobbying. I know that Rob Lennox does a lot of lobbying from CIfA, and he's talked about getting more views from the Landscape Special Interest Group. If we get big consultations that we think are of interest to all of our membership, we might start to do some questionnaires and kind of crowdsource the answers to those rather than just doing them from committee. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you know, I'm always waffling on to peatland people and other contractors in the field. I go to peat conferences, not archaeology conferences. I go to ecology conferences. I'm going to those spaces where archaeologists aren't and talking about archaeology. And when I see a graphic like that IUCN one, that they've had a previous version of that and it did not have heritage on, and this time they've gone, oh, that bloody woman, she's going to be right onto us again if I don't do that. And so they put it in, you know, and it's amazing as a tipping point what just hammering onto people for some considerable time, they'll actually go, do you know, she's got a point, just make her happy. And you can get a lot of traction that way.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks to both of you. Those are kind of the questions that we had, and looking at the time, I do think it's a good time to finish things off. Three things that I do think are worth saying is, first of all, the Time talk and the AGM will be on May 14th. And we will also send out a survey to get your opinions on how things are going. You can follow us on social media. We have Blue Sky and LinkedIn now as well. We are no longer active on X, so please don't try to follow us on there. And lastly, if you are interested in presenting your own topic so that it's not just the committee talking at you, but you also talking with us and presenting your own research, presenting things that matter to you, then please do get in touch with us so we can plan you in. And for now, thanks very much for all of your questions and your presence.